Hello and welcome to Console Classics 101. In this installment, the system is the Sega Dreamcast, first released by Sega in 1998 as the Kickstarter for what is unofficially known as the 128-bit era, or the sixth generation of consoles. The Sega Dreamcast was Sega's answer to the sluggish sales of the Sega Saturn, which had fallen far behind even the N64 and the PlayStation, as those systems were thriving in the 32-bit era. The Sega Saturn had some great games, but Sega somehow just didn't believe in it, and by the end of 1997, it was apparent that it was really on its way out. In response to that, that's when the Sega Dreamcast came out, and for North American gamers, 1998 was a sort of limbo year between transitioning between the last few really good Saturn games and then the sudden arrival of this brand new platform that, was more powerful than anything else on the market at the time. The Sega Dreamcast used a new format of disc-based media as opposed to the CD-ROM, which could hold about 700 megabytes of data, to a new format called the GD-ROM, which could hold up to 1 gig. These new format of discs allowed the system to have a bit more data, put on like some sort of developer things, or have a bit more content than CD-ROMs could do. So it was, in theory, a more powerful format. However, since DVDs were right around the corner, the GD-ROM format was really short-lived, and just like the Dreamcast itself. Unfortunately, when the system arrived on September 9th, 1999 in North America, that was the big 9/9/99 thing. That was supposed to be the biggest 24 hours in entertainment history. The Sega Dreamcast was very quietly and very suddenly retired, and it became Sega's last console that they ever made, and the system went off sale in 2002 in North America and in Europe. In Japan, the system managed to stay on a bit longer, basically on life support, thanks to its main attraction, which was arcade-style games. The Sega Dreamcast is worth picking up if you like beat-em-ups, if you like shoot-em-ups, if you like fighters, that sort of thing. If you like games that you traditionally play on a console experience for, like RPGs or such, the Dreamcast is not necessarily the greatest system out there. There are a handful of exceptions to this rule, but generally speaking, the best games for the Sega Dreamcast are all fighters, arcade-style things. Things that you'd find basically in if you put in a quarter into an arcade machine. These are the kind of experiences you'd get and thrived on the Dreamcast, much like the Neo Geo before it. In fact, it's funny because SNK had a big cross-promotional partnership with Sega at the time to not only promote the Dreamcast, but to promote the Sega or the Neo Geo Pocket Color, which was SNK's little handheld that was far more powerful than the Game Boy Color. But even so, Game Boy Color had Pokemon, and there was no stopping Pokemon, especially in the late 90s. So, unfortunately, just like the SNK Neo Geo Pocket Color, the Dreamcast was really short-lived. There were a number of really great platforms, or really great titles that came out for the platform, and it is a worthy system to pick up. However, it does have some shortcomings. For one thing, it doesn't produce 480p natively. In order to do that, you need a VGA adapter, and which is weird because the Dreamcast supports VGA, which is like a computer standard for computer monitors, not a TV standard, although some TVs do have VGA inputs. There are VGA to component and VGA to HDMI adapters, so you can get 480p that way, but not natively. The most you're going to get natively is RGB, which is maybe do 240p or 480i. The controller for the Dreamcast is a bit controversial, to say the least. This is the Sega Dreamcast controller. As you can tell, it's huge, just like the original Xbox and much like the N64 or Jaguar controllers. As such, I am not really a fan of this controller in general. For one thing, it is comfortable to use, but it's got some design flaws that I would consider. For one thing, the analog stick that it only has one. This was a time, when things didn't have two analog sticks. It's very, very loose, and what I mean by that is your thumb is very loose on it. There are these little granules that are supposed to give you some sort of tactile feel, except that once your finger gets even the slightest bit sweaty, your finger will just slide right off of it. So you won't be able to control things very well using the analog stick. The D-pad, too, is very mushy. It is extremely mushy. In fact, I'd say it's probably the most mushy D-pad I've ever used, ever. It's not terrible, except that I just don't like using it. The 4 face buttons are alright, I guess. And it also has these 2 trigger buttons, which are very similar to the analog controller of the Sega Saturn. Nothing wrong with them, they're just, triggers. But yeah, look at how much empty space there is on this controller. Look at how much just dead space there is. Here's the normal start button, and in the middle is where you would plug in the memory card, which had its own LCD screen. The Dreamcast VMU, as it was known. The Dreamcast had its own little screen that you could plug in, and it would show you some information. It also had these tiny Game Boy-like controls, except the thing was so damn tiny that, this thing was basically useless as a portable device. So that would plug into one of the 2 available cartridge ports here, which you could plug in a VMU, and you could plug in something else into the back, another VMU, or you could plug in maybe a rumble pack or something like that if you wanted rumble support in this controller. But overall, I don't like this controller. However, if you have a Dreamcast, there is another solution. That is something I've covered previously, and that is the Dream Connection 2. This device here is a little bit difficult to find, but it's very much worth picking up. This thing plugs into the Dreamcast, and you plug in your VMU up the top of this part here, and then you can plug in a PlayStation or PlayStation 2 controller and simply use that as a total replacement for the somewhat crappy Dreamcast controller. In addition to that, you could also use on this side, I should say, you could also use a Sega Saturn controller. Now, Sega Saturn controllers didn't have the analog stick, so the compatibility would just be limited to games that you could only use the D-pad for. Now, since the Dreamcast mostly had fighters and arcade-style games, that was no problem because most of those games didn't really use the D-pad or use the analog stick to begin with. In addition to that, this also has a PS/2 controller port adapter that allows you to plug in a standard PC keyboard. This was useful for things such as the Dreamcast web browser it had, and also games such as The Typing of the Dead, which is absolutely one of the best games for the thing. It's an edutainment game, but it's a take on House of the Dead 2, where you type words at the zombies to kill them. It's bizarre, and it's a whole lot of fun. It's one experience that you have to have if you get a Dreamcast. Now, this would normally be where I would go into 10 of the best games for the system and show them off. But I'm not going to do that, and there's a very simple reason for that. I actually don't own 10 games for the Dreamcast. And that might sound weird because there are a lot of games that you should pick up for the Dreamcast and worth playing. But the thing about the Dreamcast is the Dreamcast has basically no copy protection for the discs. This means that you could simply get a CD-R or CD+R and burn a game to them and simply plug in or put in the burned game onto your Dreamcast. This probably had a lot to do with why the system had an early death. But overall, there just aren't that many unique games that are worth picking up and buying at full price. Because especially in my area where Dreamcast games you can't even find them in stores. A lot of the places that game stores around me only sell like Nintendo stuff, when they sell like, older stuff, but never any Sega stuff. It's very strange. I cannot find any sort of local shops that sell Dreamcast games, and that's the honest truth. Now, for me to buy them online, this thing is very limited in its appeal. So if you buy a Dreamcast, keep in mind that it does have some good games, but you want to pick up like Soul Calibur, Sonic Adventure, and things like that. But for the most part, definitely try before you buy. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.